This is the Before You Read lecture on Israel in Egypt, Genesis chapters 46 through 50 and Exodus 1 through 6. This lecture, or at least the biblical material it discusses, is admittedly a little strange. Of course, the final chapters of Genesis could easily be treated in discussion of the Joseph cycle in Genesis, and the beginnings of Exodus could be treated on their own. So why combine them? I have combined them because I think of these 10 or so chapters as something like a bridge. They connect the first two books of the Bible, and both selections feature Israel's time living in Egypt. One of the most important functions of the final chapters of Genesis is to move the people of Israel to Egypt. The descendants of Abraham and Jacob have made their way to Egypt. Joseph's brothers and father now join him in Egypt, in large part because of his own foresight and administrative skill. And the first verses of Exodus restate this important detail. The final chapters fill out the 12 tribes of Israel when Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, making them functionally equivalent to Joseph and his brothers. In chapter 49, Jacob's final words to his sons reflect some of the later realities of the different Israelite tribes and their relationships to one another. Finally, these final chapters of Genesis help wrap up the saga between Joseph and his brothers. In the final chapter of Genesis, Joseph forgives his brothers and promises to provide for them and their children even after their father has died. In this section, we read one of the most important theological statements in the Joseph cycle. When speaking with his brothers, Joseph says in Genesis 50, verse 20, "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as God is doing today." This single verse makes important statements about God's sovereignty and human intention and really highlights the surprising, even mysterious way that God has worked in and through Joseph and his brothers. This might be a good place to sit and reflect for a while. It is the ending of the Joseph story that bridges to the beginning of the story of Exodus. The first chapter in Exodus is full of important information about the story that will unfold in its pages. It recounts the names of the Israelites who made their way to Egypt and restates the total number of Israelites living in Egypt toward the end of Joseph's death, or towards the time of Joseph's death. But then the timeline skips forward to a later time. How much later exactly, we don't know, but the people of Israel have grown and have increased in the land of Egypt. In addition, the Pharaoh that trusted Joseph and came to accept his family dies. The new Pharaoh does not have the history with Joseph, and he has no compassion on the Israelites. Rather, he is threatened by them and by their growth. In response, he makes them slaves of the kingdom and makes them perform very difficult, hard work. He even plots to murder all of the male children of his Hebrew slaves, functionally creating genocide. All of this is recounted in the first chapter of Exodus. The first chapter of Exodus provides the foreground for the book's main character, Moses, who appears for the first time in chapter 2. Chapters 2 through 4 provide details about Moses' early life, his sojourn in Midian, and his eventual return to Egypt. We hear of Moses' calling in chapter 3 and his own reluctance to fully obey the call of God, which leads God to sort of suggest a backup plan to call Aaron as Moses' partner in crime. God calls Moses and Aaron as his mouthpiece to deliver the people of Israel from their oppression in Egypt. To do so, Moses must convince the people of Israel of God's desire to liberate them and persuade Pharaoh to let the people go. Both of these tasks prove difficult, something that anticipates much of Moses' struggle in the remainder of the book. Besides reflecting on how Genesis and Joseph's theological statement to his brothers mentioned above, I would invite you to consider the following as you read Exodus 1 through 6. Look for references to sight and perception in these first chapters. Who sees in these chapters, and what do they see? What does this say about your own attention and what you see or don't see? The relationship between God and Moses is at best interesting. A good chunk of this material recounts encounters between God and Moses. Notice how they engage one another. And as with other Before You Read lectures, I encourage you to see what these final chapters say about God and what God is like. Finally, the foreground of the Exodus story is the Egyptian oppression of the people of Israel. Take time to reflect on the nature of oppression in these chapters and its significance for today. Is the form of oppression in the story of liberation totally unique? Or does it show us something more generally about oppression, the desire for liberation, and God's liberating activity? With Exodus 1 through 6, the stage is set for one of the most important acts of God in the Old Testament and the whole Bible. We meet characters who will be our literary companions for several more chapters, and we learn more about the God who calls Moses and Aaron and who works for the redemption of oppressed Israelites. Rich stuff. Now get reading.